Well, hello, this is Adam, and welcome back to Rare Classic Cars. Today we're going to talk about the Toronado versus the full-sizer, the Delta 88 Holiday Hardtop Custom Coupe. It'll be a fun comparison of the styling and the features between these two mid-60s era Oldsmobiles. Let's get started. All right, well, welcome to another Rare Classic Cars comparison. Today, the 67 Olds 88 versus the 66 Toronado. And I don't have two of the same year. I wish I had a 67 Toronado to compare here, but I don't. And the 67 Toronado was basically the same as the 66, aside from the front end styling was a little bit different. They had an egg crate grille up front, and there were no more eyebrows over top of the headlamps in the front. And of course, in the rear, you had an egg crate theme as well, as opposed to this kind of linear theme that you see on the Toronado that's repeated back there in the taillights. That would have been an egg crate theme on the 67s. Aside from that, they're pretty much similar. The interior did also change for 67 after just 1 year. But let's begin by discussing a comparison of the base price of these cars, because the base price difference is pretty staggering. The Toronado in 1967 had a base price of between $4,600 and $4,800. And multiply by about 10, and you get the rough base price in today's dollars. So $45,000 to $50,000. And that was before air conditioning, power windows, power locks, any of that power equipment and options. And so the window sticker on these could easily run to $6,000, $6,500, or $60,000, $65,000 in today's terms. And this is an Oldsmobile, not a Cadillac. So pretty expensive for that time frame. And by comparison, you've got this, talk about a mouthful, 67 Oldsmobile Delta 88 Holiday Hardtop Coupe. I almost can't even say it. Delta 88 Holiday Hardtop Coupe. And if you got the custom trim, it was the Delta 88 Holiday Hardtop Custom Coupe. That is a mouthful. But this car had a base price of $3,300. or about $30,000 to $35,000 in today's terms. So you have quite a big gap, $33,000 base price, let's just say $30,000 to $35,000 versus $45,000 to $50,000 for the Toronado. So somewhere around $12,000-ish incremental difference in base price between these cars. That's pretty profound. And to be honest, aside from the front-wheel drive powertrain, this was a more expensive car to build with the full frame and 4-coil suspension. This has a 3/4 frame and has monoleaf rear springs on either side in the back. So it didn't ride as well, and it wasn't as expensive to build, aside from that front-wheel drive powertrain underhood that cost about an extra $500 per car back in 1966 dollars, or $5,000 per car today. So that's where the money was the front-wheel drive powertrain on the Toronado. If you didn't value that, you really didn't get the value out of the car aside from the styling. Now, the Toronado, as I mentioned, was introduced in 1966, and this is the first year of it. This body style would continue on from 66 to 1970, and it have little tweaks every year. My favorite is the 66 version, and this Toronado is finished in a color called Autumn Bronze, which in this sunlight I think is just beautiful. Watch the reflections here on the wheel arch as I kind of move back and forth, and how it just moves with my movement, and also how the light flops on all these surfaces. For these cars, you want a metallic paint because it really shows off all of the various surfaces, and the Toronado has these beautiful wheel arches. That was, of course, the characteristic of the Toronado. Now, Dick Ruzzin came over and did a walk-around of this car versus the Buick Riviera and Cadillac Eldorado, and Dick was one of the designers on the Toronado in Oldsmobile Studio back at this time frame, and he was really responsible for the rear of the car, which he modeled after a Ferrari camback, because that had a chopped off rear end, and Oldsmobile Studio was searching for an appropriate rear end for this car that looked different from the Riviera and the Eldorado. And this chopped off rear end was something that neither of them had. So that was Dick's contribution to the car. The Toronado has so many interesting styling features about it. As I mentioned, it was front-wheel drive. The wheel covers here emulate the Cord 810, 812. This is the optional chrome wheels. It's one of the few options this car has, is that, and the cornering lights were also optional. It doesn't have air conditioning, doesn't have power windows, doesn't have power locks or anything like that. It does have a radio, an AM radio. But as I said, everything was optional. It does have tilt and telescoping wheel, which the telescoping ring, you just go like this. You can see you can move the wheel in and out, and to lock it, you just rotate that center hub. A very elegant design. And just a cool wheel and a cool horn. The interior, of course, is matching color with the exterior, which is one of the reasons why I love this car. I think the interior is just spectacular looking. I love the integration of the rear speaker back there too. Now the Toronado was on the same E-body platform as the Riviera and the Eldorado, but GM did a great job distinguishing the Toronado from its siblings. They did share the A-pillars, the front glass. The Riviera and the Toronado shared a roof panel. The Eldorado had a different roof panel, but you'll notice the Toronado has a different daylight opening here, where this molding and the overall daylight opening kind of comes down and then sweeps nicely into the belt line. The Riviera is different. It kind of goes out and then comes back in. The Eldorado had a different roof panel. And out back, there's the same backlight on the Toronado and the Riviera. And they both had this ventilation system here. But the Toronado has 4 louvers. The Riviera only had 2. And why they wanted to do that, I guess just to make it look a little different. But they did. The Eldorado doesn't have this out back because it has a much more formal roof line. Again, different roof panel on the Eldorado. But they all did share this A-pillar, the front glass, and the Riviera and the Toronado shared the roof panel, as I mentioned. It's a little bit of cost savings, and Dick Ruzzin also mentioned that this A-pillar, you'll notice it kind of has this smooth transition, relatively muted transition from the top of the fender up into the A-pillar, and then I love how this line just evaporates underneath the windshield molding. This feature was more pronounced originally when they were designing the car. This A-pillar touchdown was further out, and it was felt that it was too distinguishing of a characteristic that your eye would be drawn to it, and that you would know that the cars were the same because they looked the same. And so that was made more, let's say, muted, so that your eye didn't pick up on it. And it works. You don't really notice that the cars have the same A-pillar and front glass, but they do. Now there are some themes to this Toronado. As I was mentioning in the wheels, they emulate those of the Cord 810, 812, and the front end also does a little bit too, with that thin blade grille for 1966. And you also see what Stan Weiland, who was the chief designer of the Toronado, called the barbell theme up front, which meant that it was more narrow in this midsection and then kind of flared out at either end. That was characteristic of Oldsmobiles in the mid-60s. And on this car, the barbell theme is there up front. It's not in the rear, though. So, and by 67, this barbell theme is still here. It's a little bit different, but you can see it. It kind of fades out. This is a beautiful fade out of this feature line. It just fades away. Whereas on the Toronado, that goes all the way to the grill almost. Now you can see there's quite a few similarities between this 66 Toronado and the 67 88 in terms of styling. This lead-in and this very blade-like front fender with this lead-in that gently rises. This is a very GM characteristic. Fords, this would basically kind of come out more flat. But GM always had this great lead-in on their cars. And you see the exact same here. And you do notice the bumper's in a different place. The bumper goes all the way up on the Toronado, and it only kind of comes up part way on this, or a little less. And of course you have exposed headlamps here on the 67, and these huge bezels. surrounding the headlamps, and then a kind of another bezel surround here. This was the last year before Oldsmobile would go to the split grille theme in '68 that would continue on with Oldsmobile almost through the end. The Aurora didn't have that. The Aurora didn't have any grille, nor did the Intrigue or the Alero. But if you look at the '68 Olds, you'll see kind of this twin port theme that they robbed from Pontiac. Why Oldsmobile thought in '68 they needed the twin port theme when Pontiac had it since 1959, I don't know. But they went to it and it looked handsome. This was the last year before the Oldsmobiles had it. But notice the front ends, like I said, this lead-in, you also kind of have a similar W shape. If you're looking from plan view or bird's eye view facing this direction, you'll see that this forms a W. And the same is true of the Toronado. That was a pretty distinguishing characteristic of cars of this era. Many cars had that shape, front and rear. In this case, the Toronado doesn't have it in the rear because it has that chopped off back end I mentioned that Dick Ruzzin was working on. And this one really doesn't have it. Maybe it's got a very muted version of that W shape with this corner coming out. But it's, like I said, super muted. If this were a custom, by the way, it would have another set of taillights in the bumper and a thicker molding along the side, which is pretty gosh darn sweet. Now you also see, as I mentioned, the distinguishing styling characteristic of the Toronado were these wheel flares that are very pronounced here, and this feature line runs all through the length of the car, over the wheels, down the door, over the wheels, down the quarter panel. And in '67 on this Olds, you get a little bit of that. Not quite the same. Here it is here. And you can somewhat discern it. See, it's got a little wheel flare there and a little bit of an arch. Far more muted than the Toronado, but it does carry over the wheel and then down the side, over the wheel, and back down again. So very Toronado-like styling on this '67 Olds. Between the barbell theme, that line that goes over the wheels, it's just more muted. And you have kind of the Fastback profile here too. This was a typical '60s era trait and a fad that I think is beautiful, and it unfortunately only lasted for a brief time period. By the late '60s it was gone. It kind of came into vogue in the mid '60s, and for whatever reason designers wanted more formal roof lines after that. And I think it's a shame because it's just a beautiful look to the overall car. Now notice you have something else here on the Toronado. If you look down the side, see how proud these wheel arches are of the body. This is a theme that's really hard to get in a full-size car like this, where you want width versus a sporty, I'll call it a sportier car, like this Toronado, and a more intimate car. Because you can only have a certain amount of width for the vehicle, 80 inches wide, before you have to have oversized flags on it. And so when you're doing this, and you want these pronounced wheel flares, that means the body has to be inward. And when the body's inward, you have less room on the inside. So notice how pronounced these are versus how shallow it is on this '67 Olds 88. And that's because you want the big room on the full-size car. If you had these big wheel arches, you have to push the body inward, and that would take up interior room. So when they were developing this theme for the Toronado, if you watch the interview with Dick Ruzzin, I'll put it in the comment section, he talks about how Stan Weiland, the chief designer of Oldsmobile, had wanted to put this theme on a full-size Oldsmobile, and he called in Irv Rubicki, who was the former Olds studio chief, and asked what his thoughts were about it. And Irv said, "No, that's really not a theme for a full-size car. It's a theme for a more intimate vehicle like this Toronado." Hence why it's more muted on this car. I do have to say I love this rear three-quarter view of the Toronado with this feature line, especially in the sunlight, where you can see the light breaking over it, and then it just forms the whole rear quarter panel. It's like it's one big piece. Of course, there is a seam somewhere in this area here, but it just makes the car visually appealing. The interiors really couldn't be more different. Here you have the 67 Olds that it's a handsome interior. It's just not overly dramatic. Round gauges, which wasn't necessarily typical for the time. That horizontal speedometer was often pretty typical. This is more sporty. And you kind of have a bit of a plain Jane dash, but very tasteful. Beautiful seats. Beautiful bright work trim. Around the top. I love the wheel with the red center there. Now, in comparison to the Toronado, you have a much more driver-centric theme with this black area that's formed with the rubber mat that is integral to the carpet. It's one way you can tell if the carpet's been replaced in a Toronado is if that rubber mat is gone. That was factory, and it's integral to the carpet. And of course you have the rolling drum speedometer. 67 had the same theme there. The seats were different. They had buttons. The steering wheel was different. But very similar in terms of the instrument panel theme. And here you have this higher roof line. Give yourself more headroom. Despite being a coupe, this car has a lot of headroom on the inside, even in the rear. And the Toronado doesn't have nearly as much room in the rear, but it's not horrible. The seat's all the way back. The front seat is all the way back. And you can see there's still plenty of room back there. And there's plenty of room back here. This seat is all the way back too. And actually it's on, this has two settings for the seat. You can put it in a more forward position or rearward. This is in the rearward most position and the seat is all the way back. Because I'm relatively tall. Now let's take a look under hood at the Oldsmobile engines here. The Rocket V8s. Notice the Rocket logo and lots of water coming out of it because I just washed the car. Not good for rockets. All right, that took two hands, but here you have in both cars a 425 cubic inch V8, the Rocket V8. Oldsmobile would go to a 455 in 1968. It would be the first GM division to go to a 455. This is the economy two-barrel low compression 425. It was optional at no cost on cars with the turbohydromatic transmission. And it made 300 gross horsepower, 310 if it were a premium fuel two-barrel 425. And then you could go all the way up to, the Toronado had a 425, but this is 385 gross horsepower in this car, and it was also in 1967. Notice the Toronado is painted this kind of silvery blue, and this engine is painted red. Later, Oldsmobile would go to that silvery blue color on all of its engines in terms of how it would paint them. This car also has a black air cleaner. That denotes it's the economy engine. If you had a red air cleaner, it was the premium fuel engine. And despite being an economy engine, this is very pleasant, super smooth, very torquey. I mean, no complaints from this V8 at all. It's just a wonderful, wonderful engine. You can see also you have this switch for the switch pitch torque converter on the turbohydromatic 400 transmission on this car. And in this car, you have a switch pitch turbohydromatic 425 transmission, because remember, this is front wheel drive. So here's this transmission, which is effectively a turbohydromatic 400, split after the torque converter and has a Morse Hi-Vo chain that then drives the transmission, which is pointing here, into a final drive, and then you can see the half shaft there. Massive half shaft that powers the front wheels. Tremendously huge. So this was the last year, well, 66 was not, 67 was the last year of the switch pitch torque converter in these GM transmissions. You basically have a higher stall speed after you push the throttle down about 2/3 of the way. It'll increase the stall speed. There's two pitches for the stators in the torque converter, and you get a bit more power and a bit more zip in that case. And then when you let off the accelerator, you have a lower stall speed, so you get better economy. It's genius. It works flawlessly. It's phenomenal, and they only dropped it because it costs more money and just felt it was not necessary. It's very reliable too. The only thing that sometimes has a problem are these switches, and you can see if you look at this one versus the one in the Toronado, they're pretty much unique to every car. Unfortunately, GM didn't commonize these switches, and of course, after 50 plus years, they have some electrical failures sometimes, so they don't work, unfortunately. But it's also the kickdown switch. The Turbo Hydromatic 400 and 425 have an electronic kickdown. There's no throttle valve cable on these or kickdown rod like the Fords had on the C6 or the Chryslers did as well. You can notice that this is an Oldsmobile V8 because you have the distributor cap at the rear. That was in the rear on the Chevy V8s, the Pontiac V8, the Olds V8. The Buick and Cadillac would put it up here for whatever reason. Olds also had this interesting exhaust manifold where it's a smaller exhaust manifold because they inverted the intake and exhaust valves on the outer cylinder banks, so the manifold is shorter. If you look at a big block Chevy, for instance, the manifold's bigger and you'd have 4 different exhaust ports. So saved a little money there. Gotta love that. Of course, this has an aftermarket 2-piston Tecumseh York-style air conditioning compressor, and I have not taken it off because it works beautifully. It's super cold. Now, the downside is of putting aftermarket air, and this was a Minnesota car, and so it wasn't ordered with air. The Toronado was a Seattle, Washington car, and so it wasn't ordered with air, is that you didn't get the high-capacity radiator or declutching fan that you would have if you got air conditioning from the factory. Now, I have had these radiators record, and I've made them 3-row radiators as opposed to just 2-row like they were when they came from the factory, so they have more capacity. But just something to bear in mind, if you've got these aftermarket AC systems, your cooling system wasn't sized for it, and sometimes on a hot day you can run into problems. But find a good person to rebuild your radiator core, like Mel at Ferndale Radiator, and you'll be fine. And this fixed blade fan is fine. This car has a temperature gauge in it. I have never even come close to overheating, even mid-gauge. I run a 160-degree thermostat in this car. And I mean, the gauge doesn't move off of kind of the quarter position. Sometimes on a super hot day and I'm idling, I might get to a third of the way up or halfway up, and then as soon as I start accelerating, it goes right back down. So the cooling systems on these, if you have the radiators flowing the appropriate amount of coolant, work just fine. It's when they've degraded and they're plugged off that you run into problems, especially on hot days with air conditioning, or even on the freeway actually is one failure mode too, because these engines are turning relatively fast and need quite a bit of cooling capacity on the freeway. I've actually found that freeway driving heats them up more in some cases than idling if your radiator isn't flowing correctly. And the great thing is, these engines are smooth no matter what 425 you have. I mean, this, we'll start it up. Beautiful. I mean, listen to the switchgear on this. I mean, nobody's going to mistake that for a cheap switch. And the gear shift is beautiful. I love this red center hub. 1 year only Olds wheel. This car has 15,000 miles on it, original miles. Got the same massive Olds accelerator and brake pedal from the Toronado too. Interestingly, on the ventilation here, you notice this says left, right, max. On the Toronado it says, I think, min, medium, max. So here you can pick between the driver's side, the passenger side, and both. On the Toronado, it opens both at the same time. Why they did that differently on these cars, I don't know, but they did. You also have a cold light in this one. Thing of beauty, the V8s from this era. So smooth, so quiet. I love this. I left this. The previous owner put that, Lord God, grant me thy protection and help. What does it say? And keep me mindful of my responsibilities as I drive this car. In Jesus' name, amen. So, previous owner put it on there, and, well, I'll leave it on there in honor of him or her. Well, fire up the Toronado V8. This one has louder mufflers on it, unfortunately. It's getting hard to find the Toronado V8s. The Toronado exhaust systems. But notice here you can see ventilation, min, medium, max. It's a little bit different setup. But also quiet and smooth. I need a new exhaust donut there. This is the heat riser, by the way, that diverts exhaust gases under the manifold. Oh yeah. Love the sound of a big block in the morning. Nothing like the smell of gasoline. So there you have it, a comparison of the Toronado and the 88 from Oldsmobile. Stay tuned, as I'm going to be working with Dick Ruzzin more on a design book that he's publishing on the Tornado's design history. We published by Veloce Publishers. And in the interim, he's published an article in Old Cars Weekly, and I will put a link in the description. Great publication, and you can learn even more about the Toronado. But stay tuned for more videos with Dick Ruzzin. I'll put the 2 videos that he and I did together in the description to this video so you can take a look. But also check out his article in Old Cars Weekly. And stay tuned for the book that will be published by Veloce Publishing. Thanks again for watching. Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out the article on the Toronado in Old Cars Weekly and Old Cars Weekly in general. A link is in the description. And stay tuned for more videos with Dick Ruzzin and more on his upcoming book on Toronado design. Thanks again for watching.